these three rows should all move. No, no. Okay. Are you guys okay over there? Okay, you're welcome to come forward a little bit more. It's quiet, so I feel like we should begin. Hello, everybody. Woo! Yeah, this is exciting. Very happy to see you all here. So I'm Richard Carrick. I'm chair of composition at Berklee College of Music. And we're thrilled to be here at the conservatory for the second part of our presentation with our visiting artist, David Lang. Today, what I thought we would do is I just wanted to talk to you about your compositional process and something very interesting. So yesterday, you gave a beautiful, I thought, description of your music. And all of it kind of comes at the point at which the music is done and you're able to present it and you're able to talk about it. And that was really great. We talked about Prisoner of the State. We talked about some other pieces. I'm curious if we can start the discussion a little bit before that. So before the piece is written. You know, obviously a lot of composers here. Everyone's got their own process. And I think it'd be really exciting to hear a little bit about how you get into the piece, how you kind of start your ideas, where do they come from and things like that. So I mean, the first question I'll ask is, what gets you most excited about a piece before you sit down to actually write it?
That's a really great question. I think basically you want to build a world for yourself in which all you are doing is showcasing your strengths and hiding your weaknesses. And so, I say that because I know many people begin by saying the very first thing I do is I sit down at the piano and I wiggle my fingers and something beautiful happens and I really love it and then I make something great out of it, you know. And that's completely legitimate if that's your talent, you know. I mean, if that's where you come from. One of my students was the composer Kevin Putz. And Kevin Putz, who is an incredible talent and very natural and amazing pianist, we would have lessons where he would come in and he would sit down and I would go, what do you want to do? He'd go, I want to write an orchestra piece. And I would say, well, what are you thinking? Well, I guess it could start in E flat and then it could have this kind of tune come in and then it could move to the cellos and literally in 15 minutes he would outline, you know, just by improvising on the piano, a completely plausible and beautiful and musical 15-minute piece. That's his strength. So he has designed a world in which that's his strength. I am a terrible musician, so I can't do that.
Hard to believe, but yeah.
No, I am. You know, I grew up playing all the brass instruments, so I was always the loudest trombone player ever, but not the best trombone player ever. So, you know, you try to figure out what are the things that you're proud of and design a structure that gives you a doorway into your piece through that. So I feel like the most important thing that happens is me trying to observe something in the music world that a player might be capable of, that a piece might be capable of, something in classical music that's been overlooked, something that might be fun that could exist that doesn't exist yet. Then I drink huge amounts of coffee and I think about it for a very long time. And sometimes the long time is years. You know, with the Prisoner of the State that we talked about yesterday, it really was 40 years that I was thinking about that. So at least for me, I want to actually know exactly why I am doing something before I do it, so that I have everything planned out. I know exactly what's supposed to happen, what changes, what the structure is supposed to be, how things live across time, so that the very last thing that happens is I sit down and I go, okay, well, what notes can I use that will make this happen? So, and I think partly this is, you know, the way we were educated. A lot of the education that we had was note first. You know, so a lot of my teachers came from the modernist tradition where you were supposed to count your notes and you were supposed to make all sorts of incredible mathematical computations about how your notes related to each other. And if you looked at Babbitt or Stockhausen or whatever, you were supposed to start with your row or start with your notes and look at patterns in your notes and extrapolate from that things that could become phrases, and phrases that could become sections, and sections that could relate the mathematical structure of the small thing to the big structure. And it always seemed to me growing up this way that that was exactly the opposite of how we hear music. Because what we really do when we hear music is we hear the big thing, we hear the animal, and we don't hear the little cells, right? If we're interested in how the animal works, we might want to look at it and discover, oh, it's really neatly put together. But what we pay attention to as listeners is, and what moves us and what has the emotional connection is the larger thing. So I always felt while I was going through that period of education that that we were learning how to focus on absolutely the wrong thing. Or at least for me, it was the wrong thing. And so when I started thinking that when I was a student, I started trying to imagine if that's the wrong thing, if we should be thinking of the bigger thing before the smaller thing, then I need to dedicate myself to thinking about bigger things.
I just want to stay on this a little bit longer because it's so interesting. The big thing. What is the big thing? Because it feels like the big thing has changed over the course of your career in terms of what the piece, take Prisoner of the State, it's a really big thing, and it's also got another very big thing, the Fidelio opera, which is part of your piece. But if I think of some of the earlier chamber pieces, I feel like they're great pieces, and maybe they're a little bit more in the, what we might say, like the abstract music world, as opposed to the overtly theatrical world that I feel like a lot of your music is in these days, which is super exciting. We'll talk about more of that later. But what is that thing? Can it be anything? Like when you talk about having a vision of what the piece is, does it have to have some sort of narrative? Does it have to?
No, but the narrative, whatever can take the place of a narrative, makes it a lot easier for me. And again, I'm not the kind of person who is going to sit abstractly and think, I need a tune which accomplishes this, and now I will challenge this tune with some kind of other tune, and I just don't think that way. But earlier pieces like Cheating, Lying, Stealing, at the time that was the biggest thing I could think of, trying to figure out why you are a composer and what it is you're doing and what it is you are revealing of yourself. The whole point of Cheating, Lying, Stealing was to say that we always talk about music as if composers are working autobiographically. So it's just a trope that we listen to Schubert and we go, we can tell from Schubert, from his cadences, that he was gay, or that we are looking at different kinds of things about Mozart and extrapolating enough about his music to be able to make a feature movie about him. We somehow have this idea that the composer's autobiography, the composer's memoir, is encoded in the music. I'm not sure that that's true. Right, and I'm not sure that when you listen to Beethoven, you can tell that Beethoven was really not a very nice person. Or when you listen to Wagner, I don't think you can tell that he wasn't a very nice person, and I don't think it really matters. But with that piece, I was trying to think, well, this is something that we always say in classical music, that this music is revealing of what the person actually does. What if that's true? What does that actually mean if music is capable of doing that? Well, what are you revealing about yourself? When you hear a big melody in Tchaikovsky and it's really beautiful, what's the autobiographical part of that? In Tchaikovsky, it must be, not only am I capable of writing this beautiful melody, but writing this beautiful melody says something about who I am. I believe that this kind of expression and this kind of emotionality is important to me. And you are crying listening to this music, and I can tell you I am crying too. I'm crying with you. There's a way in which we use these things as the music is a stand-in for something that the person is supposed to be about. So I thought, if that's really true, then people are telling you the things about themselves they're proud of. Tchaikovsky is emotional, and Milton Babbitt is very brainy. Like, look how smart I am. I can do this really ridiculous thing. These are all things composers are proud of. So I started thinking, well, I think about myself, and I can immediately identify 100 things I'm not proud of. Why, if I'm using music autobiographically, am I going to use it to show you the things that I like about myself? When, in truth, when I think about myself, all I pay attention to is, all my bad features. It would be lying to you to make a piece that shows you, how brainy I am or how emotional I am, So then I started thinking, well, what if I could write a piece of music that was trying to be autobiographical, to let you know what a cheater and a liar and a thief I am. And how would I go about that? How would I consciously go out of my way to let you know, okay, well, I'm a thief. Well, the opening tune I stole from something, right? And I hid it so well that no one will ever find out where I stole it from. But every time I hear it, I know, yeah, I didn't write that. Everybody loves it. I didn't write it, And so that was it, to me that was a big thing at the time, but it was trying to find an idea that would allow me to investigate more what it is that we are doing, right? And part of this is trying to figure out, what is the most honest and efficient way to get to the thing which is unique to me? And that's something that everybody has to do for him or herself.
Yeah. So, in that vein, how do you know when a piece is done? I mean, there are always points where you kind of hit a brick wall, or there's the difference between the idea of the piece that you've projected and your abilities and your talents and your interests, and you mix them all together. And at some point, the idea changes, right? Because I remember a composer who I studied with many years ago said, if you write the piece that you kind of started off writing, if it's exactly that piece, there's something wrong with it because you weren't part of the process. And you kind of mess up your idea and you make it your own and you create something new from that. And so there's a struggle there. So how do you, at what point do you feel like the piece is done?
Sometimes you only know you're done when the commissioner is writing you nasty emails every day. I find that that's a really big help. But I don't actually, I don't necessarily disagree with what your teacher said, but I look at it a little differently, which is I think when I have these big ideas, I can imagine a piece from start to finish, and it's like watching a movie on a small black and white television. And then what your job is as the composer when you're writing the notes and trying to work out all the details and make it work is to make that, little black and white screen into a total Technicolor giant movie theater experience, It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen a movie, like on a small screen or on your computer and then seen it in the theater, right? And you realize it's a completely different experience. I always think that that's the difference between where I am starting with these ideas and what the end result is. It's like you know where everything goes, but you're adding the emotion and you're adding the detail and you're adding the reason why someone would want to listen to it in the first place.
Do you ever have those experiences? Beethoven talked about this a lot, where he'd have a melody running through his head for years, and then he'd finally find the right place to put it. It might be a symphony, it might be a string quartet, but he had that melody, he had something kind of floating around that he didn't know where to apply it. Do you also find that?
I have no melodies floating around. I have nothing floating around in my head. I'm really sorry.
Okay, well.
Now I feel really bad.
Well, you have plenty of other things floating around in your head. We know that from your music. Let's talk a little bit about the voice, if we can. Yesterday, one of our students, Kunal, asked a question about text, which I thought was very nice. But I'd actually like to shift that discussion and actually talk about the voice as an instrument, because it feels like it's become very important in your work in the last number of years. If we can separate it from the instrument that projects the text, I feel like there's something really powerful in how the voice expresses something deeply emotional in your music. In a way, your music can be incredibly direct, and something about the voice humanizes it and kind of brings out the emotional content in such a powerful way. Can you talk about that a little bit in your relationship to the human voice as an instrument?
Yeah, I had written songs in theater, and I'd written one or two choral pieces, and I'd written some opera, right? And that was basically what I had done with voices. Yeah, I didn't really know what to do with voices. They were part of my life, but not a big part of my life. And then the piece that won the Pulitzer Prize, The Little Match Girl Passion, happened. And I didn't realize this, but that was the first a cappella piece to ever win the Pulitzer Prize. Since then, Caroline Shaw's piece, Partita, has won. But back in those days, that was the first and only a cappella piece that had won the Pulitzer Prize. So, like, within a week, all sorts of people from the choral world had gotten in touch with me, essentially saying, oh, you have finally made everyone pay attention to how valuable we are, and we would like to ask you to write a lot more choral music. So I immediately got swamped with more work, which I didn't know what to do with, and I didn't particularly want. I wasn't really seeking it out. And I grew up singing in choirs, and I'm not a particularly big fan of choral music. Even now, I don't really I wouldn't say I like choral music or vocal music or whatever. I don't really care for this, right? What I care about is text. So when you say this thing about separating the text and the voice, I'm not sure I've ever done that, because to me, the whole point of text is it's the closest thing that can be on a stage to us individually, right? I always think when you write for a pianist, when you write for a piano or a piano solo or whatever, you get the incredible musicality of the pianist, and you get this incredible, training and virtuosity and thoughtfulness and, talent and amazing capabilities that a pianist has. And you also get a giant piece of furniture that sits on stage, that blocks your view, that separates you from the inner core of who the pianist is, right? Everything that pianist is doing has to go through this thing, it's mediated through this thing, and then it comes out at you. It's like, like some modem or something, it's like here's the person with the idea, and here's the server, and then you're receiving it, And that's true with every instrument. A violinist could be the greatest musician in the world, but when you work with that violinist, you're going to get the violin also, You can't actually do one without the other. With a singer, you get the thing which is the closest approximation to who you are individually. It's someone standing in front of you with nothing. No safety net, no mediation, no tricks, no screen, nothing, And so when you can say something that person feels, it's the easiest way, the most complete way for that person to transmit something to you. And so once I started working in that world, I hadn't really been working in it before. Once I started working with a huge amount of text, I realized that I'd been missing something for all of these years. That when I was looking for the big thing, when I was trying to think about ways to think about something that was outside of music and outside of myself and something that was larger than just making the note details of a piece of music, that was the thing. It was text is another way that I can communicate with people in a way that we all kind of agree, sort of, about what these things mean. And then the music can be used to challenge or underscore or deepen or threaten or compromise or twist the things that we supposedly agree on. And that became super fun for me and super inspiring. And since then, I've written some purely abstract pieces of just instrumental music since I started doing that in 2008, and I like them just fine. They're totally fine. I don't mean to say anything bad about them, but I've really been captured by text. And so, and to me, that's the value of working with singers, is not because voices sound great, but because I need the voices to animate the text.
Great. It seems like there's also something else. The pieces you talked about yesterday and the pieces I know of your last 10 years, they've opened up somehow in terms of their relationship with the community, with the audience, with the performers, with the venues, with the space. And it's incredibly exciting. I mean, you look at, if you look at David Lang's last 10 years, you'd think this could be 100 different composers, because you're able to kind of throw singers out onto, in the middle of the street, or you're able to do an opera in this setting, and you've really kind of opened up these parameters. I mean, I guess there are a few questions. One is, when you're also working off of commission often, and what's so impressive is that you're able to, within the commission framework, create these completely unique works of art. You're not being assigned the 15-minute orchestra piece and things like that. So could you talk a little bit about that and kind of how you got to that point? It's really incredible.
Yeah, well, okay, the commission thing is really interesting because if you think about it, most music in classical music was made on commission. So almost every single piece of Bach's commission. Every string quartet of Beethoven, commission, right? Composers, basically, our repertoire is made out of people responding to requests from other people. And what those requests usually are is someone with money and power and a venue saying to a composer, I need this. There's a lot of music that's written that way, which is terrible. And in fact, most of music in classical music history is just functional, because that's what the commissioner wanted. So one way to look at what we study in music is we look at the composers who have risen above that basic level of what happens when a composer is commissioned. There's this thing in the 18th century and the 17th century called Tafelmusik. I don't know if you know this, right? So Tafelmusik is music that's commissioned for rich people, for nobles in the 17th century, to be played in the background at dinner, so that, it will be charming and they'll have a wonderful time. And, Mozart, who is the world's greatest melodist, the person who was most able to make incredibly beautiful melodies out of small material, right, at a drop of a hat. Mozart was commissioned to write Tafelmusik. So imagine going to someone who is the greatest melodist in history and saying, we would like you to make music that's boring enough so that we can eat dinner while it's played in the background. And Mozart did it. And this music is very beautiful, it's very skillfully made, but it's toned down from what he does in his string quartets and his operas and his piano concertos. And the reason why is because the commissioner did not want anything of what his talent could give. His commissioner just wanted music for the background. Most church music that was commissioned when Bach was a composer, we do not still remember. Because the church needs a lot of music. The church has always needed a lot of music. The church has been the #1 commissioner for music in our history as Western classical musicians. And most of that music was not required to do anything, but to get a bunch of monks from one side of the altar to the other. And anything more than that was gravy. What we study when we study music history is we study those few pieces that rise above what the commissions ask for. So what I've always felt as a composer is, why should I let the commissioner determine what I do for my music, right? The commissioner should not be the person who is telling me how I want to express myself. If I think the point of writing music is to find something inside of myself and get it out, Well, that's of no interest to the commissioner at all. The commissioner says, I have 5 minutes at the beginning of this program, and that's what I need from you. It needs to be loud, and it's going into a Beethoven symphony. So, can you do that? That's what they want. So what I've always tried to do, and what I tell my students to do, and what I am now telling you to do, is what you need to do is imagine what kind of music you are really interested in. What are the things you really want to do? What are the things that you believe in most powerfully? And make a long, long list of what those things are. What are the things you really want to accomplish? And what happens is when someone asks me now, do you want to write a piece for this amount of time and this situation? I ask them if I can do something else. And I've been doing this actually for 30 years now. And what's the worst that can happen is the commissioner says, I want a 5-minute piece for ensemble, and you say, I'd like to write a 10-minute piece for orchestra, and they say, no, I didn't lose the gig, right? But I told them, this is the closest thing that I have to you. It's almost like what you asked for, and this is what I believe in, and this is what I really want to do. This will really make me happy, and believe me, it will really make you happy too. And most of the people will say no, but occasionally someone will say yes. And those people will become your friends and your supporters and your collaborators and your colleagues, because those are the people who listened to you, who cared who you were, who cared what your experience was, and that's how you decide who your people are that you're going to go forward with into the future. So I've been doing this for over 30 years, and a lot of times people just say no. But as you get older, people know a little bit more about what they're getting, and so it becomes easier for people to say yes. But again, I think the really important thing, and this it goes back to every single thing that we do, it's going to be kind of like a running theme of everything that I talk about, which is it's knowing what it is that you want to do. It's knowing what your strengths are. It's knowing what you want to accomplish. It's knowing what you are curious about. It's knowing why you got into this world in the first place.
A little bit along those lines, do you ever feel that you have, let's see, I worded it so well here earlier. I had a really good one. Do you ever feel like you have to stick to a technique or a musical style that you've previously written when you sit down to write a piece? Do you feel any sort of, you're saying you don't feel external pressure to do that, clearly, but do you feel any internal kind of, I kind of want to try something new, but at the same time, I'm feeling a pull here? How do you deal with that?
Okay, I had this really kind of interesting experience when I was very young. I mentioned yesterday, for those of you who are here, that the thing that sort of started my career is that while I was in graduate school, a former roommate from the Aspen Music Festival won a competition to do a Carnegie debut and commissioned me to write a piece for her. And I wrote a very, very flashy, exciting, obnoxious, virtuosic violin and piano piece called Illumination Rounds that got played, like millions of times and won lots of competitions and was, and people, as soon as she came off the stage, essentially from premiering this piece, I had work in New York. But the weird thing about it was I had a kind of psychic breakdown after this piece because people heard the piece and they came to me and they said, oh yes, this really flashy, virtuosic, amazing piece. Can you write exactly that same piece for me? And famous people. So it's like I had a conversation with Emmanuel X. That piece was great. Can you write that same piece for me, only just not as hard? And
without the violin.
Yeah, and without the violin. Yeah, and so I got all this request for work, right? And on the one hand, I was really flattered because I thought, okay, this is really great. I can have a career. I was really happy, right? But then I started thinking about it, and I thought, I did this thing. I'm 22 years old. I did this thing that everybody likes. No, I wasn't 22. I was 24.
There's a big difference at that
Big
age.
difference, yeah. I'm on camera. I don't want to say anything wrong here, but I started thinking, I think what I've just uncovered is the music world telling me, if you never change, we're going to be happy. Like, you found something here that's useful to us, and we don't ask of you anything else other than that you are just useful to us right now. And I remember thinking, okay, I uncovered this thing where I just show off that I know how to do this. And if I just show off this way for the rest of my career, my children will have shoes. And it really kind of flipped me out, because I thought that that the world had shown me how little it was interested in who I was. It had shown me what it needs. I hadn't shown them what I need. And then I started beginning to doubt what I had done. And I started thinking, I wrote this really flashy piece for this violinist. Did I write that flashy piece because that's who I am, or because I wanted people to like me? Did I write that piece because I wanted to let everybody know that I was skilled? In which case, is that really authentic to me? Is that what I want to be doing, So then I started thinking, I sort of went off the deep end, and so I answered a lot of those commissions by writing pieces that were exactly the opposite of that, pieces which were very stripped down and minimal, and pieces which were not orchestrated, and pieces which were completely made out of the barest material to be the opposite of that. And that wasn't a very smart thing, because that pissed off all the people who commissioned them. But partly it was, I think, because I was looking at composers like Philip Glass. So I worked for Philip Glass in the early 80s. So like Akhenaten was just at the Met. I typed all the words in the score. That was my job in 1983. And I looked at Philip Glass and I thought, he has a sound, right? He figured out how to make these arpeggios into a kind of a trademark for himself, and it works for him. It's totally great. It's really fantastic, and I don't mean anything bad about his music at all, because of course he's a great composer. But there's a way in which classical music really only expects out of composers that they take the one thing that they do and make it into a kind of commodity. If you can find out what your shtick is, if you can find out what you are known for, this is my thing, then you can just never change ever again and let everybody know this is what I do, and then you can market it, and you can make yourself into an object, you can sell it, people can buy it and know in advance what they're buying. And so as part of this big personal rejection, when I had that moment of thinking, what the heck am I doing with this, virtuosic piece, I started thinking, maybe my pieces should be thought about the same way. They should be, like I should use my brain and my thinking process to investigate problems the same way, but that should not necessarily result in having any two pieces sound alike. And so I've gone out of my way to try to make pieces in different modes, to make pieces with different kinds of musicians, to make pieces in different environments, to make pieces that sound completely different, that have different formal structures, that have different, kind of emotional trajectories. And part of that is the result of trying to sort of live by idea first. But I think it really came from that original sense that that really I was 24 years old, and if I had never changed, the world would have been really happy. Right? I wouldn't have been happy, right? But the world would have been fine, right? I would have had work. I would have been fine, right? The world did not expect of me anything other than to be the composer of that one kind of thing that I could present and manage and never change. And for some reason, that just didn't sound like a life to me.
And yet you were still able to continue with work, even with this decision. And what's really cool as well, the flip side is that you constantly created new learning opportunities. Every time you'd write a piece that you hadn't done before, it was kind of opening up your artistic possibilities, you know. And that's a huge thing that I think a lot of student composers think about. It's like, well, I'm going to learn my craft, and then I'm going to go out and do it. And I think one of the things that I most respect about the work you've done and the work that I know of yours is this idea, you know, you take control of all aspects of your music. It's part of community, it's part of working with others, it's part of learning from others, and this relationship that keeps brewing kind of new ideas and expanding on music. You're always creating new learning opportunities for yourself and your music. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. You know, it's like you want to not be, stale to yourself. You know, I think also it's interesting the way you said it. It's like, because that's exactly the way we're supposed to learn things. You learn your craft and then learn where your craft goes. I always think, and of course that's the way I was taught too, right? You know, maybe it's better to think of it the opposite way, which is think about where you go and then learn the craft that you need to go there. So certainly, you know, in the last 10 years, I've been doing these pieces for communities, right? So for amateur musicians. It's not a huge part about what I do, but I do something with amateur musicians, you know, probably every year or so. And again, it started yesterday with that story that I told about writing a piece for 1,000 people yelling in the street in Berlin. So I wrote that piece called Crowd Out, which is basically it's my remembering what it was like to go see an English football match where everyone is like singing. And what was really shocking to me about that experience was that you're in this crowd of 60,000 people. It must have been 1992 or something, right? So I'm friends with the composer Mark Anthony Turnage. And so I used to stay with him when I would go visit in London. And so 1992, he said, "Oh, you can stay in my apartment," because his girlfriend was someplace else. So I stayed in his apartment for a week while I was working at the Almeida Festival or whatever, and because he lived in that neighborhood, and also in that neighborhood was the old soccer stadium, the football stadium for Arsenal, which is this, you know, gigantic, incredible football team. I'm not a sports person really, but I had nothing to do and he wasn't there, right? And so I'd be rehearsing during the day and I'd go back to his little apartment, and so I walked by the stadium and somebody was handing out tickets, and so, you know, I bought a ticket to go in to see the match. And Arsenal, the fans are really loud and obnoxious, and they have all sorts of incredibly rude songs, you know, like "Up, Up, Up the Arsenal," and you know, they're really funny songs that are really ridiculous. And I went into this crowd of 60,000 people, and they're all singing these incredibly rude songs, and it was really fun. And I felt a couple things. You know, the first thing I felt was, if I knew the song, I could join in. We don't feel that in classical music. Like, you don't go see, you know, the Missus Solemnis and, "Oh yeah, I know this part, I'm gonna join in." You know, we don't do that, right? But the other thing that was really interesting is these people were all, you know, music was a huge part of this experience. They never shut up, these people, right? It was, you know, incredible. And no one auditioned them. And no one asked if they had good voices, and nobody cared if they were better than the person sitting next to them, or nobody was showing off, right? Everybody just knew all the rude voices and all the rude words, and they were just all yelling along, right? And that seemed really liberating to me, because in classical music, our job is, you know, you work with you know, a B symphony in the hope that you can work with a B+ symphony, and then you hope you can work with an A symphony, and then I'm never working with a B symphony again. You know, it's like we have this stratification of musicians in classical music where we only want to go up, and A musicians would never be caught dead talking to B musicians, you know? It's like we really have this very strange idea of the hierarchy of value in classical music. I went into the place, there was no hierarchy, right, at all. Everybody was equal. And I thought, I'd love to write a piece of music where everyone who was there could participate. Everyone who wants to come to rehearsal, who wants to put in the time, can learn how to do this piece. So I had that desire. I got that commission. I figured out, who would be part of this. I figured out how to design a program that would reach out to people in these various communities. It was commissioned in Birmingham, England, in London, and in Berlin. How to reach out to different, kind of communal groups who would participate. And then I had to figure out how to make a music which was hard enough so it had to be rehearsed, so it could accomplish something that had a trajectory that I wanted, that expressed what I wanted to express, but that was open enough so that people who couldn't read music would be able to do it. And that was, kind of a learning experience for me. And I did it just sort of as a one-off to try to think if this was interesting. And I loved it. I thought it was really fantastic. And to work with ordinary, normal human beings is actually really great. I still like working with really good musicians, but, and for them, I write really hard music. But the idea of working with normal people and writing hard music for normal people to conquer is also great. What's interesting is people struggling to get better than themselves, to work within a community, to build something beautiful, is something that's so powerful and so necessary in our democracy that it seems like a real loss if we only let the highest level of professional musicians experience that. So I made this piece, and I discovered not only did I enjoy doing it, but I also felt like I had uncovered the key to democracy. I'd uncovered something that I believed in very strongly politically, which is that what we need to live in the world is a reason for us to all believe that we need to live in the world together. And I suppose when people were all religious in a community, maybe that functioned that way, or when people had political parties that actually were honest, maybe it worked that way. But I know that music may be the very last place that we have in the world where people get together and build something with their neighbors without asking themselves, how much money do you make? I'm going to make my decision about whether or not to work with you based on whether or not we're in the same economic bracket or the same race, or whether or not I believe in your politics. No one in a choir ever says, I don't like the politics of the person sitting next to me, so I'm going to sing really badly. But that's the way we are in society. This is the only place where that kind of democratic faith still exists. So I did this piece, and I loved it so much that I just decided I'm going to keep doing things for communities. So after that, I did a piece called The Public Domain, which was very self-consciously about trying to identify things that we need from each other. What is it that we can all agree on that we need from each other? My opera On the High Line was for 1,000 community singers in New York lined up on the High Line, each of them singing something very personal to us. I did a piece for all the broken musical instruments in the Philadelphia public school system, because it turned out that there are 1,500 broken musical instruments in the Philadelphia public schools. And, to me, I'm only a musician because there were instruments in my public schools. Like, every part of my classical music background comes from the fact that I went to a public school system that had instruments. So these were 1,500 inner city minority students in Philadelphia who did not have the opportunity to have their lives changed the way mine was changed. And in Philadelphia in particular, as many of our inner city schools are, why don't they have that money to fix those instruments? It's because, it really is because of the incredible inequality and racism that's built into our public education system. So once you start pulling this thread of trying to make things with ordinary people, it leads you into all sorts of things that are essentially more important than being a classical composer, which is how you are a good citizen, how you live towards your neighbor, how you live in society, how you can imagine how to live in a better world, and what your obligation is to use your personhood to try to make that better world come about.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
That was a long answer.
That's a great one. I have one more question before we turn it over to the audience, and we're happy to have questions from anybody here. Thinking of how you spoke about when you were a young composer and when you were 24, and you kind of entered into the concert scene, and thinking of the challenges that you had then as a composer and your colleagues at that time. And now you're a professor and you work with many students who are that age, but the climate is different now. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what are some of the current challenges that you see for young composers and current pitfalls that they might be coming across, and if you have any kind of words of advice for many of our young students.
That's a good one. Well, one of the things that was really weird when I was young was that we were, again, I don't mean to keep harping on how weird my teachers were, because modernism was a very weird thing for people my age, right? So we went through this thing where people had decided that music should be this one particular way, and so that created some problems for composers themselves, as I mentioned earlier about looking at the notes before looking at the structure. It created some problems for us because we were taught that there's one right way to make a piece of music, and all other ways are to be shunned, and all people who are making music other ways are to be shunned. So that's very bad. One of the other ways that was bad was to make audiences feel that they were disaffected from the kind of music that composers were writing. So it sort of built this world where you can imagine a kind of Mount Olympus, where there's this mountain leading up to the gods, and at the top is one god male composer, and at the like maybe on like the cliffs around are some other male composers you're trying to claw up to that that perch, and down below under the clouds at the foot of the mountain are ordinary people who are not fit to climb the mountain, right? And so the way the music was presented to the public was, you're not going to understand this and you're not going to like it, but you just have to trust us that these composers are geniuses, and if you were a genius, well, you would get it, but you're not a genius, are you? And we can prove it because you don't get it. So as you might now, of course, there's a lot of great music that was written from that world. I don't mean to take anything away from that. That world created a lot of really great music, but the problem is it drove a lot of people away, because that's not a way to build an audience. That's a way to say, as Milton Babbitt said in Who Cares If You Listen, there are only a few people in the world who are going to be elevated enough to understand how beautiful this is. But it really is beautiful, and he's right. For the people for whom this works, it really works. But the problem with that is twofold. One is it drives the ordinary audience away. And so it drives away opportunities in that world. For example, my teachers, when I was an undergraduate, said, we don't have an orchestra program for composers because no orchestra will play any music by any composer who's worth anything. So why should we teach you how to write for orchestra? So my first piece for orchestra was for the Cleveland Orchestra, and I didn't know how to do it at all because my teachers had actively told me, quality music will never be played by an orchestra, so we're not going to teach you how to do it. You need to concentrate on the Pierrot Ensemble. You need to teach you to concentrate on the Sinfonietta, because we have, the London Sinfonietta and the Ensemble Moderne, and that's what you need to concentrate on. So a whole generation was basically, told that this was not going to work out, right? That's a terrible thing to tell to audiences and to composers. But the other flip side about having this model about the one, loner genius god on the top of this mountain is it means that all the other composers who are scrabbling to get to the top are presented in competition with each other. So I really felt when I was growing up that the message that I got was, in order for me to be a composer, I had to find another composer who was in front of me and push that composer in front of a bus. That was the secret of my career. And if I didn't push that composer in front of a bus, somebody would push me in front of a bus. That's the way I was educated. I was educated to be in competition with the students of the people that my teachers didn't like. I mean, it's hard to believe, right? So one of the things that I've really tried to do my entire life, and what we've tried to do at Bang on a Can, what we've tried to do everywhere, is to make composers care about each other, to make composers support each other, and to make composers nice to each other. So to me, that's the most important thing that I can say to you about what to do. And the example that I will give is that Nico Muhly, who is a composer who is not much older than you all, and who is very successful. So when Nico Muhly came up, there was a lot of jealousy. People were jealous of Nico because he was young and getting all of these opportunities. And what happened was he got a piece at the Met, and now look at the Met. They are now commissioning young composers. Nico has a piece done with this orchestra. Other composers then get that gig. What it means when one of you is successful, when a young composer is successful, your first thought may be, why did that opportunity go to that other person and not to me? But you should get rid of that first thought. And the second thought is the truth, which is if one of you has a successful experience with anyone, everyone will notice and go, oh, young composers are really interesting. We have to find some for us. So what happens is when you think of yourself as an individual fighting with other individuals to be the lone god on the top of the mountain, it becomes very difficult for you to imagine how to live a life in public. But if you imagine what you are doing is each of you is advocating for this field, you are each of you going out telling people why it is of value to have new music constantly refresh who we are and refresh our old institutions. That's our job. If any of you goes out and refreshes anything, if anyone has a good experience, it opens that door for all of us to continue having more experiences. So my advice to you, other than to just write really good music, is to care what happens to the ecology of the composers and the performers around you. If you are good citizens to each other, it will help you be better composers and live better lives.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy. We have a little bit of time here. Is it okay to take a few questions?
Please.
We'd love to hear what's on people's minds and what you'd like to ask David Lang. So Greg has a microphone. Okay.
Froze out yesterday, so okay. He's going to kick things off. So, first of all, thank you for being here. I have a question regarding two of your pieces, one of them being Light Moving and the other being Wiggle. So I know they're not necessarily related, but in looking at those two pieces, I realized that you made some connection between the real world experience of yours and translated it into music. And if that's the case, what was your approach in taking something in real life and abstracting it into a musical art form?
So Light Moving and Wiggle are the two pieces. Well, the thing that those pieces share is they're both super, super, super hard. And they're kind of ridiculously hard. And the instruction on how to play both of them is as fast as possible. So what I thought about both of those pieces was it was kind of like, you know, usually I'm really interested in notation, and I'm interested in the limitations of notation. And again, when I was, you know, a student, everyone was totally obsessed with looking at Boulet's structure or the Stockhausen pieces where you have 12 different values of dynamic, and we are over-specifying what happens to players. So I started thinking after that, I really want to under-specify. You know, if you go back to all the Bach pieces, they don't tell you how loud or how fast they are really, you know. So there's a huge amount of variety in what it is you're supposed to do with those pieces. And what that means is it's not the composer saying, here's an idealized version of the piece that I am ordering you to follow, but it's more like a problem for people to solve. And so the piece presents itself as being, here's something that you can figure out. So Light Moving is for violin and piano, and it was written for Hilary Hahn. And when I talked to Hilary about, you know, she commissioned it for this Encores project, and I asked her, you know, some questions about what she can play, and essentially her answer was, I can play anything, you know. So I thought, okay, try this, you know. So I wrote a piece that just says, as fast as possible. I mean, how can you reach the limit of somebody who says, I can play anything, right? So, so the whole point was, yeah, you think you can play it? Well, play it faster. So, and Wiggle, you know, was again a sort of impossible piece, a sort of like a piece which is in one line, which is as fast as possible, which is itself incredibly hard, and then the second half of the piece, it plays as two lines at exactly the same speed. So it's sort of a piece that I thought of as a kind of joke, in a way, which is that you can play the first half really fast, but you can't play the second half that fast, can you? Those pieces, so Light Moving, these are not really, the Light Moving is not really kind of like a big idea piece, really. Light Moving, for those of you who are not up on your minimalist history, but Steve Reich and Philip Glass, before they were successful composers, they were in New York in the 60s, had a moving van, and they would move people's furniture and move people's art, and that was how they made a living. So the idea that these two great giants of minimal music had a company, and it was called Chelsea Light Moving. And so so I wrote this piece, and it's just a repetitive piece from start to finish. Wiggle comes from a series of pieces called memory pieces, and these pieces are pieces that are in memory of friends of mine who passed away. And the big idea with this was, I was thinking, we're used to memorial pieces in music that are about grand statements that bring us all together to think about some tragic thing, you know. I think of the Verdi Requiem or something. You know, it's like someone died. You know, it's like a political person dies. We write a piece of music. We all get together. It's a big public statement of how terrible we all feel, right? And there's certainly a value for that. That's really important. You know, the John Adams on the transmigration of souls, right? You know, I mean, there's a value to this kind of thing where we all want to be in a group of people. We all want to remember something terrible that happened. We all want to think about it at the same time, and it's a fitting memorial. But I thought, what happens when people die, like when I have friends who've died that you didn't know? Like, why should I make a big public event to memorialize somebody who's important to me that you don't know, right? What's the point of that? There's no point in having a big social event about, let's all get together and remember this friend of mine, right? It seems really, you know, out of balance. Like, it seems like, why would anyone care about that? You know, the only person who really cares is me. And what do I care about? I don't want to really remember these people as being, you know, miserable events that killed them at the end of their lives, you know. So I just thought maybe I could use a little piece of music as a way to be a marker for a conversation I had with them, or something that happened in my relationship with them. So, like, I'll never forget this person because here's this little conversation I had with them. So Wiggle is in memory of this really charming, delightful, old composer named Frank Wigglesworth, who actually was from up here. I don't know if anybody of you knew Frank Wigglesworth or his music, or you might run across his name occasionally someplace. You know, is not somebody who put his music out, but he was just a really funny guy, and you know, and we used to make fun of his name all the time. You know, you go over to his house, and his wife would call from the other side of the house, "Wiggy, come here," you know, and so I just made a piece called Wiggle because I would remember all the funny things he told me, you know. One of the things he told me is that when he was 13 years old, he was writing music, and his mom brought him to visit the famous composer Walter Piston, which I think was up here, right? So it's up here, right? So and so he was really nervous and he was really shy and didn't want to meet Walter Piston. His mom made the appointment. He goes in to see Walter Piston. Walter Piston didn't want to meet him either, right? So he goes into Walter Piston's office, and Walter Piston sits and he looks at his music, and he pages through his music for a few minutes, and then there's a couple minutes of silence, and then he looks up at the 13-year-old boy in front of him and he goes, "Do you want to mow my lawn?" And he said, "Sure." And then he ran out and he mowed Walter Piston's lawn. So basically, every time I talked to Frank Wigglesworth, I heard a funny story, you know. So so that piece is basically, you know, the music of those pieces sometimes has more of a relationship to what the story is. But
Hi. So you seem like you are a very successful composer. But
I only seem like it.
Well, I'm wondering. Well, you have a Pulitzer Prize, but I'm wondering what you see as a very successful piece. What makes a very successful piece to you, and why? If it's a Pulitzer Prize, like what would make it?
Okay, I think the Pulitzer Prize has nothing to do with it, you know, and none of the prizes matter, right? The most important thing that happened to the prize, from the Pulitzer Prize, actually, was that my parents were really mad at me for not going to medical school, and like the only thing that got them off my back, that got my dad off my back, was winning the Pulitzer Prize. You know, it's like then it was like, we can relax. You know, it's like maybe things will work out. But basically, you know, prizes are really. Well, I'll answer the question, but I want to go back to prizes because I started applying for competitions when I was like 14 years old, right? So I remember sending to the BMI Student Composers Award, which I guess you can only get until you're 25, right? And so I would apply every year, and I would lose every single year, right? And I was like 23 or whatever, and I met the person who was running BMI at the time, and I said, "Oh, you know, my goal is I'm going to be the first person to lose this prize 10 times, this competition." And she said, "Oh no, we've had people who've lost it many more times than 10 times." And so I remember thinking I would work really hard, I would really like the music, I would send it into the competition, and then I would lose. And then I would go, "These bozos, the people who are the judges, they don't pay attention, they're terrible, they're really awful, nobody is honest, they're not looking at the music, they're such cheaters." And then I sent in the violin and piano piece that I referenced earlier, and it won. And then I remember thinking, oh, they are so noble, they are so great, such talent, they care so deeply, you know. And then I remembered thinking, wait a sec, last year they were bozos. It's the same people. You know, how can it be that last year they were bozos and this year they are paragons of virtue? It must be that applying to competitions is completely irrational and a crapshoot. And I can tell you from having been on every panel known to man that it is completely an accident that anyone is rewarded for anything. It's very nice, it may be very helpful, but it is complete accident. And I say that both ways. It is a complete accident when you are rewarded, and it is also a complete accident when you are not rewarded. It is exactly the same, which is important to remember. The answer of how you know you have made a good piece is the thing that is the most important part of writing music, and that is the most personal thing. I think the hardest thing to do as a composer at any level, young or old, is to be honest with yourself about what it is you've done. You put in the work, you've slaved really hard, you've written something down, you've polished it, you've listened to it a million times, you've rewritten it, you've sculpted it, you've tried to make it really good. It's hard after you've put all that work into it to evaluate it honestly and say, you know, I really worked as hard as I could, but you know something? That doesn't work. So a lot of what happens when you are a composer is we have a natural tendency to talk ourselves into liking things that we have done. And again, this happens at every level, you know. And that, to me, is the biggest danger of writing music, is that you put in the work, you know why everything is there, and then you have to evaluate whether or not it's good or bad. So then you need to figure out a tool for yourself that works so that you can get to the thing which feels most honest for you. So the thing that I do in my pieces, which is how I know if they are successful, is when I am done with the piece, I go back to the beginning and I look at it very carefully and I sing the whole thing through to myself and I go, I like this, I like this, I like this, I like this. I love that, I like that. If I can go through a piece of music and I go, I like, I like, I like, I love, if there's something in the piece that I love and the rest of it I like, I tell myself I have to get rid of all the stuff that I just like and only have the thing that I love, because life is too short to have the things you like. So if I can go back and say, you know, this is the core of this piece, this is the part that really pleases me, this is the part where I think what I wanted to accomplish really happens, then I have to get rid of everything else. And that's how I know I've done a good piece.
Hello. So I believe in your music, emotional is important. So have you been to a situation that you get too emotional in your music and then you start feel like lost and then in your own feelings and like to like the rational and like just for composition, and then you want the music to be emotional. That two things, the balance. Have you been to this situation, or if yes, how did you fix that?
You know, there are lots of different ways to be emotional in a piece of music, and what I really want to do in a piece is to talk to myself the way I want to be talked to. So I want to have the kind of emotional experience for myself that no one else is going to give me other than me. So I don't like the things that are overwhelmingly expressive, and I don't like the things that are manipulate me into having a kind of feeling, you know. So to me, like the greatest experience that I can have in my life, because it's the way I want to live my life, is to have an experience where I have to think about it for a week, and then a week later I go, that was much heavier than I thought. You know, that was really powerful. You know, it's very possible to use music to manipulate people, to actually make them feel happy. And in fact, most of the music that we hear in our lives is music that has a real function. It's supposed to manipulate you. You're supposed to hear this music and go, must buy that car, you know, or you know, hear this music, you know, must jump when, you know, man stands in, you know, the shower with the knife, you know. You know, it's like music has a function, right? There's like one right answer for what we are supposed to do when we hear each of those kinds of music. So I don't want to give the sense in my music that that there's one right answer. So, you know, I can give two examples. You know, it's like back to this idea of a memorial piece. So I had a very close friend who passed away, a woman named Betty Snap, who was the person who worked for the publisher that found me when I was a young composer and really helped me out. And she became like a very close friend. And nobody knew her. She was a really wonderful person, and then she died, and I had to figure out, you know, what to do with this. So I wrote a piece of music called The Passing Measures, which is this 45-minute long piece that's basically a chord that falls a fourth over 45 minutes, you know. And I thought, nobody knows who this person is. I'm the only person, you know, who is upset by this. So I'm going to make not a piece of music that shares our grief, but something that's more like a grief object. You know, I'm going to make a piece of music that's just like this thing that allows you to project your emotional feeling onto this, you know. Like, I'm going to listen to it, and I'm going to be miserable, but you don't have to be miserable. Basically, it's 45 minutes of permission for you to feel whatever you want to feel. So it's supposed to put everyone in the room, it's supposed to make everyone in the room comfortable enough to be able to feel what he or she would like to feel. It doesn't say, now's the moment when the veil falls, and now's the moment when the spirit soars. And, you know, there's nothing tacky about it. It's just like, here's this vaguely depressing thing that happens. It just falls a fourth. That's it, you know. And you may not even notice that it falls a fourth unless you go back to the beginning right after the end, you know. But so the idea was to make something which was emotional the way I want to be treated emotionally, which is I want to go into my thoughts and have them for myself. I don't want someone to pre-chew my thoughts and give them to me. But when you work in film or television, of course, that's not what you are expected to do. So sometimes you have to do the opposite. So my story with this is, so I wrote the music for Paolo Sorrentino's film Youth. And in this film, which leads up to the final scene where the aging composer Michael Caine, when he was young, he wrote the most beautiful piece of music ever written. And at the end of the movie, we have to hear this music. So they talk about this music the entire movie long. And it has to be this emotional thing. And I kept writing the music at the end, you know, and sending it to the director. And the director would write these notes, these emails back to me. He would listen to the demo, and he would go, "Oh, David, I am crying, but I am not crying enough." You know, and these kinds of things. So I wrote the most emotional thing that I could believe in and I could feel comfortable with. And there's this big moment where the entire orchestra comes in, and it's the Hollywood moment, which would be explosive. And in the score, I marked it mezzo piano because I thought, okay, it's so full and so rich, and it will be quietly devastating to have all this density come in. And we recorded it at Abbey Road Studios, and it was unbelievably fun, and it was beautiful, and we mixed it, and it was fantastic, and it was great. And the orchestra comes in, and you feel the fullness there, and you feel the restraint, and it really meant something to me, because I really felt like, oh, this is so restrained. It's amazing. It's so un-Hollywood. So I go to the premiere of the film at the Cannes Film Festival, and we get to that moment in the film, and when the orchestra comes in, the orchestra comes in super loud, and my bass drum, which I had marked piano, is now 4 Fs. So I went to the sound editor at the reception, and I said, what happened? You know, it's like we recorded this thing, we mixed it, it was so beautiful, what happened? And he said, oh yes, we were mixing it with the director, and he just said, oh, that section, turn it up. That was it. So when, you know, it's like, so in that world, you need the emotions to be more obvious. In the concert world, we have a wider range of emotions available to us, and so I feel like it is more noble for us as composers of concert music to take advantage of the wider range.
maybe one more question? How about two more questions? Sounds good.
So you do a lot of work with large ensembles, and I was wondering if you start with short scores for any of them, or if it depends on the piece.
I never used to work with short score until I started doing big operas. And I always thought all my ensemble pieces have been written without short score, now that I think about it, and because the quality of the instruments is important, and that's what you're taking into consideration. So for me, actually, all of my large ensemble pieces have been straight to the final orchestration. But the operas are short scores. So I'm trying to think about, yeah, the orchestra pieces are straight to the orchestration. But I think that's probably a sign of the hierarchy. It's sort of like the instrumentation is only there to serve what happens in the voice. So that's the part that really has to be captured first. This is the last question, so make it good.
Oh no, okay.
The pressure is on.
Yes. Hi, thank you so much for talking and sharing all these stories. I'm really, really curious about your music for communities or for amateur musicians. Just thinking about writing a piece of music for 1,000 people in Berlin, I think it's probably possible you could have found 1,000 professional musicians to do the same project. So my question to you is, was the choice to use amateurs like an aesthetic choice, or was there like do you see an advantage to that? What was your process?
Yeah, it definitely was an aesthetic choice. If you write for 100 professionals, you're going to write really hard music that they can rehearse, and they can, accomplish something incredible. And I have written music for 100 professionals, now that I think about it, but 1,000 professionals might be hard. The point of these pieces was to give the joy of rehearsal to more ordinary people. So to invite more people into our world, and to broaden the meaning of what participation actually could be. And the funny thing about those pieces, which I know sounds like an incredible amount of chutzpah, but it says in the score to those pieces for 1,000 singers how you can scale them up really easily to 50,000 people. Because each of those pieces depends on a small group of people that's coordinated with each other. So really each one of those groups of like 25 to 50 people needs a leader. And so what it says is, once you as an amateur have gone through this process, you are then qualified to become a leader of another ensemble. You know how the piece works. And so if you take all the people in that 1,000 performance, and each one of them becomes the leader of 50 people, it could very easily be a piece for 50,000 people. So the point of it is to, kind of propose a piece of music that can kind of have as big an invitation possible to as large a part of our society as it can be. I mean, I love the idea of imagining what it would be if you could write a piece of music so that everyone in your neighborhood could be in it, or everyone in your city, or everyone in your country. So I had this great experience once when I was a kid. Not when I was a kid, when I was 18. I spent the summer studying in Russia because I was in love with Russia and Russian music. And so I spent the summer studying in Russia, and I came home through Finland. And so I met a friend who was a student at the Sibelius Academy in Helsinki. And so we were talking about Sibelius, because I like Sibelius. And so I said, oh, you're so lucky in Finland because your country's national anthem was written by a real composer. And so she stood on a street corner and she started singing Finlandia, which is a beautiful anthem. It's not the official anthem, but it's, kind of like the unofficial anthem. And we were on a street corner, right? And everybody who was walking by just stopped and started singing along with her, because it was their anthem. They knew it. It was written by a real composer, and they loved it. and they all sang along. And I just thought that was really beautiful, you know. And now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure I made the connection until just now, but probably these pieces have something to do with that experience.
Great. Well,
Great, thank you.
please thank David Lang for this wonderful interview. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Richard.
You're all welcome to join us for the masterclass at 4 p.m. in William Davis room, which is in the 150 building. So thanks again. Bye-bye.